Hello, this is Dr. Kathy Januso from the Institute of Consultative Bioethics. I am delighted to have with me Greg Dober, bioethicist, author, and prison advocate. Greg, thank you for being here today. And to get started, why don't you tell us about your background? Usually, people who enter bioethics tend to have an interesting story behind them. What's yours?
Well, we don't want to call them interesting. We'll just call them a story. But no, my actual background at one time was in business. And probably about 20 some years ago, I had some personal things in medicine between family and myself. And one of the things that I couldn't understand, I was trying to figure out how medicine can be so advanced, but patients' rights and ethics, you had a lot of paternalism yet. And there was a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of poor communications with doctors and, treating my parents. And I couldn't figure out how, we could be the best and greatest healthcare provider in the world, but yet people don't even understand what's going on around them when they're under the care of a healthcare professional, including myself. I actually kind of changed careers and went back to school and ended up getting degrees in healthcare ethics and bioethics.
And I know, Greg, you've not only spent a lot of your time in the healthcare setting and facilities as well as academia in the bioethics field. I know that you've also spent a lot of time in prison and in the jail system.
Yeah, kind of interesting. Yeah, I've probably been following the prison system. I'll start out this way. A colleague of mine, we wrote a book. His first book was in 1999 called Acres of Skin. One of the first things I got interested in bioethics was actually research ethics. And ironically, the book he wrote was about how the government sponsored research in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. And basically, the prisoners had no rights. And this was in the 1970s, 60s, and 50s. They had no they basically were told, you know what, you'll get some incentives if you go through these experiments. And some were Agent Orange, and they were pretty bad. So as I came along, prison started interesting me because of my that book and my friend. For whatever reasons, I kind of just took it upon myself as vulnerable populations. I started becoming more interested in vulnerable populations. And I use vulnerable populations as in the bioethics talk, not in a political talk, meaning, children, prisoners, that type of vulnerable population, which codified in the research law. And so I kind of went with prisoners there. Then I ended up getting invited to join an organization in Pennsylvania where we go in and we actually mitigate prisoners' disputes and complaints. And we're the only state in the union that has it, where we're basically a private watchdog. So it was kind of interesting. Over the years, I've noticed that a lot of academians never wrote about prisoners, never even thought about prisoners. And again, I see certain bioethicists on TV, on CNN, I'm not going to name them, they'll talk about everything, but they won't talk about prisoners. And I was like fascinated, like, you talk about a vulnerable population, but yet this is academia doesn't address it. So I kind of merged the two. And over the years, I became sort of an expert in prison healthcare and prison, ethics and prison law for healthcare. I do go into a prison. Give you, for instance, I'll be in a jail for 3 hours on Monday. This Monday, last week, I was in a state jail for 5 hours, mitigating things. I went over a hunger strike with an inmate who was on a hunger strike, and I convinced them to get off of it for various reasons. And we can go over that a little bit later about forced procedures. Mm-hmm. But so I do probably spend quite many hours in the prisons and jails in Pennsylvania. And probably 70% of the issues are healthcare.
Are you able to separate healthcare from non-mental health to traditional healthcare?
Do you mean in the prison itself?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I get called in for everything. I get called in for even abuse, verbal abuse, from guards to maybe somebody who's homosexual, something like, I can get called in for any reason. Stolen property, I can get called in if I think it warrants a visit. But probably 70% of the times we're called out is healthcare. So it's predominant. As far as mental health, the mental health sort of flows in with the healthcare. And that's so I'm going to lump the mental health into the healthcare problem.
Okay.
So, and that's kind of where it goes.
All right, very good. Well, what are the issues that you most come into contact with?
Well, we're going to stick with the healthcare, obviously.
Yes.
In healthcare, one of the problems you have, there's really two issues, and I'm going to exclude this from mental health right now. But the two issues are the prisoners' rights to make medical decisions for themselves, and the other one is what is adequate health care in a carceral facility. Now, I'll go with the adequate health care for now. Years and years ago, what it used to be, jails didn't have doctors, we'll go way back. And in 1926, there was a court case that came along, and it was in North Carolina. And a sheriff ended up shooting a burglar. His name was Peter Campbell. And the sheriff, his name was Spicer. Well, what he ended up doing is he ended up shooting the burglar. And what happened was the burglar, they usually would just take him before jail and take him to the local county doctor. Well, the county doctor said this guy needs surgery. So the sheriff said, fine, I'll take him to the surgeon. So he ended up taking him to a private hospital, which was back then run by a surgeon. And the surgeon removed the bullets, and he wanted to know who's going to pay for this. He said, I don't know, bill the county. The sheriff actually the doctor billed the sheriff, and the sheriff refused to pay it because he didn't have the money in his budget. The sheriff then told the county, you got to pay this. And they refused to pay it. And they said, we didn't authorize you to take him to a surgeon. The surgeon really didn't care. He just wanted his money. So Spicer, who is the actual plaintiff, V. Williamson is the case. Spicer v. Williamson. Williamson was the sheriff. That was the first case where a judge ruled that if the government deprives somebody of their liberty, they're responsible to care for them. So in this case, they basically ruled that Spicer should have gotten paid by the county. That case became on the books, circulated throughout the United States as a precedent, and most states stuck with that. They said, yeah, okay, the cases are more likely if this goes to court, we're going to lose. We deprived them of their liberty. Around 1976, another case came. This was the first one that really went to the Supreme Court. And this was Estelle v. Gamble. And this sort of became the monument, the Sentinel case. Gamble was a prisoner, and he kept hurting his back on a work detail. Well, every time he'd say he hurt his back, they would say, we don't care. And every time he'd decline to go to work, they would throw him in solitary confinement. The doctor would come, look at Gamble and say, well, here, I'll give you 2 Advil at the time, 2 aspirin at the time. Gamble still said, I can't go. I can't work. Well, they would then throw Gamble back in solitary confinement because now he's not following the doctor's orders. What ended up happening was Gamble sued, and he had basically said, hey, this is a violation of my 8th Amendment rights. And the 8th Amendment is very simple. It's the one we all know is cruel and unusual punishment. That, we basically, when we're arrested or detained, the Constitution protects us against that. Gamble had won the first case, and Estelle, who was the prosecutor for the county, took it to another court, and this is in Texas. Eventually, it made it to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court ruled is they said, look, the same thing. They said, in Gamble's case, he wasn't subject to an 8th Amendment claim. He was subject to malpractice. In other words, the court ruled, they said, look, here's the problem we have. We're not sure if it was cruel and unusual punishment or it was just bad medicine. So what they did is they gave the county basically a waiver. They said, we're going to count this as malpractice case. So if Gamble wants to continue, he's going to have to file a civil suit because we're not finding it yet as cruel and unusual punishment. But they did put out the big thing. They said, look, all prisoners are required to have adequate health care under the Constitution, or it will become a constitutional issue under the 8th Amendment. So that's the first time it was ever defined that all prisoners are entitled to adequate health care. Again, they basically said at this point, they did not, malpractice didn't matter because that's a civil issue.
But did they define adequate health care?
No, that was one of the problems. And in future cases, you've had future cases coming, even you had Schwarzenegger in California. That was a case where they never defined adequate health care. And what they usually do is they defer it. The judges say, well, adequate health care is based on some standards that the American Sheriff's Association would have or the American Correction Association has. And when I look at them, they're really not even adequate health care. They're more or less quality control on how to get a piece of paper across a desk. Mm-hmm. But no, and I'll give a recent one. One of the things that was tried in courts probably 10 years ago was the HCV, the hepatitis C medications that are out now. Before, you used to have the new antivirals that were out for hepatitis C. You used to use the interferons, they were called. And what happened is they would take up to a year, I believe. But the side effects were so bad that most inmates would last about 5 weeks and say, no more, no more. So what ended up happening was the treatment for hepatitis C, even outside prisons, it was difficult to get people after a while to want to have that treatment. Along came a couple companies, Johnson & Johnson's, Gilead Science, and they came out with a new class of drugs called direct-acting antivirals. The problem was it was $60,000 a treatment. The interferons were a few thousand. Question came in, do prisons have to go with the standard of care, which the CDC now says that direct-acting antivirals at $60,000, or can they go with the old cheap and less reliable other medications? That's what I'm talking about when it comes to adequate health care. Mm-hmm. A lot of DOCs had to be sued into giving the new drug. Because, again, they were saying, well, that's adequate for us. A lot of state judges said, no, you really need to go to the standard of care. So it kind of there's a line there. And I always kind of say that adequate care can be malpractice care. Because as we saw in even Estelle v. Gamble, the fact that they gave him aspirin, and he did have a fractured disc in his back, and that's what they found out he had. Even then, they said, well, that was adequate care. It was just malpractice care. So I always kind of make the argument that, malpractice care can be adequate care in a prison.
And that's their level of responsibility then, adequate
Correct.
care.
Correct.
And now I think at one point you had mentioned to me that one of the biggest issues is providing health care in the facilities. Is that true? Did I get that right? Care in the facilities. Is that true? Did I get that right?
The jails itself. Right now there's a big problem going on, and there's a shortage right now of all personnel in prisons and jails, and that includes corrections officers. But yeah, there's a whole problem, in fact, getting qualified people to come in and want to work in that environment. But even still, you have a problem with just who these people are. And for instance, a lot of these people have mental health issues. So, you got to worry about undereducated and uneducated. So again, trying to get them to give informed consent and exercise their autonomy is difficult. So even just dealing with the person is tough. There's a lack of privacy and confidentiality. I mean, seriously, it's usually, you could ask an inmate on a certain block, and I'll bet you they could probably tell you just about everything that's going on with 90% of the inmates on their cell block, including what medications they take, when they go down. I'll give you, for instance, one of the things is always repetitive. If you might get your Suboxone at 9 o'clock every Wednesday morning. Well, if you leave your block at 9 o'clock every Wednesday morning to go down to the medical, everybody makes the assumption, and probably correct, he's getting Suboxone. He must be a drug addict. Mm-hmm. So privacy's gone. So a lot of people, avoid, especially when you had the HIV drugs and even hepatitis C. They don't want to let people know that they might have one of these infectious diseases. So that it's like, well, I'd rather not get treated rather than be down there and everybody's going to know I have HIV.
Which then becomes their right. They
Correct.
cannot be treated because
They
they
can refuse.
Yes.
Right. Now, there's some court cases that are out there for mental health and psychology drug that say they can be forced, but there's also cases out there saying they can't force them. And really what it comes down to, if they're a danger to themselves or danger to the prison, they can be forced. So there are court cases that do that. On the others, there are some that say they can refuse. And some of them aren't even court cases for carceral issues. Some of them are actually bioethics case for people like you and me that, we can refuse surgery. They just can't drag us in and say this surgery is best for you and we're going to do it. So those same private cases still go to inmates. And a lot of people think, oh, there's got to be a whole different set. It's actually not. And one of them I talked to about is when it comes to informed consent, they have the right to, they also have the right to direct their own care as far as this is what I want, this is what I don't want. They have the right to informed consent. They have the right to advance directives. And that's one of the things I teach a lot of doctors and hospitals is there's no new set of rules for inmates. And you're going back to two classic bioethics cases. Karen Ann Quinlan, which was in the 70s. She was going to be pulled off life support by her parents, and the state of New Jersey told them that they're going to charge them for murder if she's pulled off. Eventually, the state of New Jersey Supreme Court then agreed that it did fit the privacy. And back then, you had a lot of privacy cases. We just saw Roe v. Wade, overturned in a privacy issue. But this was also a privacy issue in 75, and the court said, no, they do have the right to privacy, to family to make its decision. And so she was taken off. Then, and you had Cruzan going probably around 1984 or 85, I believe, where she basically was in an auto accident in a persistent vegetative state. The family wanted to pull her off, and the state of Missouri said they were going to hold her for murder. This was the first case that ever went to the United States Supreme Court for right to die. Quinlan never made it that far. But what Missouri said is they wanted compelling evidence to take her off. And the Supreme Court ruled with Missouri and said they have every right to protect a person's from being, pulled off life support. It's a societal thing. But if the Cruzans could come back and give compelling evidence, then it would be done. And they actually did. They actually brought friends in and said, hey, this is what she wanted. And that was sort of the advent of the advanced directive movement, where we now can make, as individuals, non-incarcerated, we can make an advanced directive and say, this is what we want. Inmates have the same right. They can make, and they can name a surrogate as well.
And because of the case, Slowender versus Society of New York Hospital. Well, the case said that incarcerated prisoners do have rights, the same rights as any other citizen as far as healthcare is concerned.
It does. I mean, it does. And one of the arguments is always resources. And this is an issue. How much resources do we have to do all these expensive operations? And again, what do we spend on? What's the price? And it's sort of going back to the drugs for hepatitis C. If we can give them old, why can't we give them old? But again, you got to look and say, what is the standard of care? Because I make the argument that I say, look, anybody in prison or jail is not, they are sentenced there by a judge's order. And the judge's order is to only take away their liberty, not their human rights. And that's always the thing. I always look at it and go, wait a second, taking away their liberty means they're incarcerated, they can't go out, they can't do certain things. But we also have this human rights issue. How far do we go in calling human rights? Well, this is just a privilege in society, and when you get to it, really, medical has been one of those things that's been argued because we talk about universal medicine in the US. Is it a human right or not? But I think most people would agree that punishing people by neglecting their health probably would not be good constitutionally.
When you look at the number of incarcerated individuals, what % are mental health issues?
I'm going to say there's no definitive source. A lot of my sources, I'll use academic journals. I'll use the Bureau of Justice and Statistics, their statistics. I'll use local, and you'll find for mental health, it'll bounce around, but there's a general consensus. And just two things, just two terms people need to understand what a difference between a jail and a prison is. A jail is for people who are primarily detainees. And if they're sentenced under 2 years. So, for instance, you get busted for, we'll say, DUI. You'll go, you can't post bail. So you end up in jail, a county jail usually. Your hearing might not be for 3 months. So you're going to stay there till your trial. And if you're found guilty, the judge can say, well, you just did time served, 3 months, or I'm sentenced you to 1 year. And at that point, you're going to stay another 9 months in the jail. That's what jails are. They're short term, they're usually local. Prisons are usually state or federal run, and usually they're for people who have been sentenced for over 2 years. So, for instance, that same guy who comes in, say he was put in for murder, and he goes to trial in a year. He's in jail for a year, couldn't post bail, goes to trial, and the judge sentences for 10 years. Well, at that point, the judge will say, I've sentenced you to 10 years to a state correctional facility. So after 1 year, because of the crime he committed, the sentence he committed is in excess of 2, they'll move him to a state prison. So you got longer term criminals at the prison, shorter term, and more detainees, because people who go to jail, and that's the other thing about healthcare, you got a lot of innocent people. And I know that's a joke a lot of times about, well, everybody's innocent. Well, in jail, until they go to a trial, they are innocent. So when they can't post bail, they are missing work, they're missing their family. And if they're found innocent 6 months later, there's no restitution. So if you deny them health care and other rights, you basically took away a citizen who is innocent their rights for 6 months. So that's why we also have to be careful when I say about treading on the Constitution. But the reason I tell you that is because there's a difference in mental health. A lot of statistics show that probably, and I'm going to use national, and I see this a lot, probably between 40 and 50% of inmates in state prisons have some type of active mental illness. In jails, I think it's higher. And the reason I believe it's higher is because the jails tend to be the gatekeepers. So they're getting a person who's off the street. They might go in for 6 months and they'll never see prison. So the jail may have that person that's in there for 6 months who's mentally ill that never goes to a prison. So I'm going to say, and I know a local county surrounding Pittsburgh just showed me a report last week where only 38% of their inmates were classified as not having a mental health history or an active mental health illness. So 40% are, quote, considered non-mental health cases. So 60%. So it's high. As far as addictions, I'm not going to classify that mental health issue, but again, there's a lot of things saying between 40 and 50% of all inmates or prisoners have some type of active addiction going on. One of the problems we have in this country, we quit treating mental health at the mental health medical level, and we actually turned law enforcement into our new orderlies to treat mental health. And it's a problem because they're not trained to do that. There's a lack of psychiatrists and psychologists that do the prisons and jails. Sometimes they won't give the newest and greatest drugs. And so it's a problem. So a lot of these people go in and get out. They're basically returning to society no better off than when he went in.
Mm-hmm. What is being done now in the prisons to address mental health?
Well, it's funny because, again, we talk about adequate care. What is adequate mental health care? Because it's under, the healthcare umbrella. Most jails and prisons recognize that they have to do something. They need to at least say, well, we can get them on a drug. We can do this. But they just lack the resources. I mean, Allegheny County Jail, for the longest time, they get 3,000 inmates at times. They had 1.5 psychiatrists. Not many people are running to knock down the door to be a jail psychiatrist or a jail psychologist. So you have a problem with getting qualified people to treat them. And then the same thing, getting qualified people who are in mental health experience to come into the jails and work there. So the biggest thing is a lack of resources is in experience in treatment. So that's one of the problems. The other is again, if a judge orders this person out after 30 days, even if you're halfway through his treatment, you let him out, you don't know where he's going to go. Will he follow up treatment or not? We don't know. So a lot of places still try to treat the mental health, but on the other hand, a lot of them just do it because at this point, it actually makes for a better jail. Because think about it, if you had these many people who aren't on medication, you got a lot of COs and people that could have problems, safety and security issues. And sometimes we worry about that. We'll hear of people on lithium and these things. And I mean, I saw inmates at the state facility where they were basically catatonic. They had so many drugs in them. And it's hard to say that shouldn't happen because you don't know how dangerous this person will be if they weren't under that state. But then on the other hand, we've taken away their, ability to even function.
Mm-hmm. Does that get into then forced procedures?
Yes and no. When you get forced procedures, as you said, a lot of times the inmates, when it comes to the mental health drugs, I'm going to say 99% agree that they need to take something. It's usually never a fight. I've never run into where it's a fight with prisoners as far as getting something. In fact, most of our complaints are they've taken me off my medication, believe it or not, and I want back on it. So it's kind of interesting. Most of the time, it goes the opposite. I'm not getting the mental health treatment I think I should.
Yes,
Which
and
is
that's
interesting.
surprising. Often when individuals get out, they do go off their medication.
And I get, two visits I think of. One is I remember seeing a guy, very bright guy, and I could just tell. And I said to him, he was just getting out. He was in for about 10 years, about 8 years. And he had done something, violated his parole, went back and served his total sentence. And this was at the state facility in Pittsburgh when it was open. And I said and I was like amazed that this guy was intellectual. And I started talking to him. I said, I got to ask you something. How did you get here? Because you're like one of the brightest inmates I've with. And he skipped senior year in high school. He was a very bright guy, but his parents did not want to admit he was mentally ill, so he never got him treatment. So what ended up happening is he got in trouble because of his mental illness. Then he ended up getting alcohol addiction. Then he got treated. And he did exactly what you said. He was paranoid schizophrenic. He then decided he moved back. He went with his old friends. He got off his medications. They were in a bar one night. He was stinking drunk. He passed out in front of the bar. A police officer came. Police officer tried to shake him and wake up. And he said, not being on any more drugs for paranoia, schizophrenia, I thought, I didn't even see a police officer. I saw a man trying to kill me. So I started punching him. He said, so here I am serving like 7 years for assault on a police officer and the violation that I had prior to me getting out. And I thought, again, that was interesting. Here's a guy who basically said, it was my fault. He says, I need to get out and I can't do that again. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. So he understood that when he got out and went with his old friends, got off his medications, he realized how he got there. And I was like, wow. And you don't get those epiphanies all the time. Yeah. Now, to tell you the kind of people that are in there, I got a letter one time, and it was an inmate asking me to plead, and this was at Pittsburgh, to plead with the warden to get the microchip that was put in his throat. And it said that the warden, the DOC had put a microchip in his food, specifically meatloaf, put it in his meatloaf. He ate it. It's in his throat. They're doing that to track him and for mind control. Now, when you get a letter like that, the first thing you're thinking of is how can he be a criminal if he's that insane? Mm-hmm. So again, the same thing. I sit there and I go, wait a second here. Should he even be in jail? I mean, I know he committed a crime, and that does require a punishment to take away some liberties. But I'm like, here he is in a prison, and he truly believes that he has a microchip that the state put in him to follow him around, do mind control. And it was sort of like that oxymoron. How can he be in prison for a crime and that he should be in a mental facility? Mm-hmm. So that happens a lot.
How do they look at the forced feedings when someone doesn't want to eat? Does the institution see that as a mental health issue?
And here's why. I actually have had calls from hospitals throughout the United States asking me what happens when we got a patient here who the DOC or some law enforcement sent and they're on a food strike. I tell them don't feed them. First of all, inmates have the constitutional right to go on a hunger strike. That is the Constitution. I support hunger strikes. But I'm going to tell you there's conditions. The World Medical Association supports hunger strike. In fact, they have two declarations. The Declaration of Malta, which was in 1991, that talked about doctors should not treat hunger strikers. In 2005, they had one in Tokyo about torture, that doctors should not feed hunger strikers unless it's suicide. Hunger strikes, you do have a right not to eat and hunger strike if it's going to be for a constitutional issue. But the courts rule liberally the opposite, because there's also a thing in the law that prisons are allowed to do whatever they want as long as for the good order or security of the prison. So if you go and you're a hunger striker and it goes to court, 98% of the judges will say, we have to roll with the institution because they do have their right to have good order and security. Again, if it's a non-constitutional issue because the guy don't like the food, that's not a constitutional issue. Even I'll go, he shouldn't be even hunger striking. But if it's about true abuse or true violations of like cruel and unusual punishment, that is a constitutionally approved hunger strike. The things that I tell doctors, when you receive a hunger striker, and there are ways that the DOCs do, they'll give them 3 meals. If they refuse 3 meals, it's for a couple of days. They then document it. So they actually have a checklist of what they consider somebody on a hunger strike. The time they get to the hospital, I tell doctors, do not touch that person or you will be held for battery. You need to get a court order. You tell the DOC to go to a judge, and the judge will give a court order for you to do it because it's a medical procedure. It's an NG tube. So as far as the doctors are concerned, I advise every doctor never to touch a hunger striker without a court order.
So let me walk around this a little bit. So that might answer the question. If you have somebody who's on a hunger strike, they get to the point where their life's in question, who gets to make that decision if they do not have an advanced care directive?
In Pennsylvania, we actually have a decision-making law. And the decision-making law is a default. If you don't have an advanced directive, as I always tell people, the warden is not on that list. I mean, your cousin is on that list before the warden. So there's all kinds of decision makers out there before the warden. So wardens can't pull plugs. Wardens can't give treatments. They can't advise treatments. It's up to the inmate to do it. And if not, inmates can file, like I said, an advanced directive, and they can file a guardian. They can say, look, this is my decision maker. But as I even tell jails, because I'll give a talk at jails, I'll say your default is Act 169 in Pennsylvania. So if this guy writes nothing down or this woman writes nothing down, you got to go by the law. And I'll be honest with you, you don't know how many times I tell this to clinicians and they're stunned. They go, you mean I don't have to listen to the sheriff or the CO? And I tell them that, no, it's your hospital, it's your patient. You do not follow anything they tell you. I mean, I've had people actually tell me, the corrections officer tells us to do this. And I tell them, get lost. I say, you know what? If it's a medical advice, no, you make all the calls. Now, when you give them an exit, that doesn't mean they'll go do it at the jail. So if you give them, say, we want to follow up outpatient, do this, that doesn't mean they'll do it. But as long as they're in your facility and your care, they're your patient. The law protects the doctor, the nurses, and the clinicians.
Does anything change when institution is privatized?
You, as far as a medical facility?
Yes.
No, doesn't matter. It does not matter. The same law affects us all, as you know. And again, for decision making, is based on the medical ethics and medical law, and not on any type of correctional policy or law. And that's the other thing I always tell them. They'll say, "Oh, we have a policy." Well, the Pittsburgh police policy used to actually violate state law. And I'm thinking of a case around 2013 I got involved in. Young man got shot in Pittsburgh, and he was in Mercy Hospital, I believe it was. I mean, I'll name it, it was public, or it might have been Presby. It was one of the UPMCs now. And the family was not allowed to go see him. And he was single, he lived at home. The police refused to allow the mom and dad, who were his caregivers, to go in and talk to doctors and make decisions. Well, guess what? That's their policy. I had the policy hold for a right to know, and it said supervisory officers are allowed to determine who can go in and visit somebody. Here's the problem. When you have that, you basically turned away all his medical decision makers. The Pittsburgh police didn't care about that because that's their policy, but yet they were violating state law. So, yes, in fact, it became, there was a criminal case too because of the officers shooting, quote, an innocent man. But in the civil case, I actually talked to the attorneys, and I told the attorneys about that. I said, look, here's the problem you have. I said, when the minute they turned the parents away, they turned away as decision makers. I said, the way I would look at it is the judge should have had a court order to turn away. They told the parents, go get a court order from the judge if you want to see them. To me, it should have been the opposite. The police should have had to go get a court order to keep the parents out, because the parents were the legal decision makers. So what I'm getting at is judges don't even know this law half the time. In this case, the judge should have actually said, well, wait a second, if they're the decision maker, but you know what? A lot of these judges don't even understand the decision-making law in Pennsylvania themselves. So in this case, he should have said, well, wait a second, I have to let them in. Who's going to make his medical decisions? No, he says, I'll grant the warrant. My argument was it should have been opposite. The police should have said, we want to keep them out. We know they have the right there, but we want to keep them out for whatever reasons.
Mm-hmm. And it does seem that no matter how we turn and years have gone by, we've talked beginning of the 1920s, it isn't getting any better. I don't see it improving, because even in Allegheny County, they're now talking they're going to have a liaison. And that sounds really good. But based on everything you said, I don't know that there's always there's ethics codes for everybody in the prison. And there's a lot of ethics going on. It just doesn't seem like it's applied. And from what I'm hearing, it's not getting better.
No, Allegheny County, you can't be impressed by the liaison, because that was after 15 deaths in 2 years. That was basically forced upon them. But no, it's not getting better. And, I look, and I'm going to blame the clinicians as well. A lot of the doctors in that, they enable this because they don't know the law when it comes to decision making and things like that. So I'm not going to give them a free pass. I'm scheduled to do a talk at a facility in 2 weeks about this decision making at a hospital. And the look I get from people is astonishment. So the fact that the hospitals and the clinicians enable this, it's a problem. So I have to put the blame on them because they're the gatekeepers. So when it comes to decision making, I blame the hospitals. I don't blame the prisons, because guess what? You should know the rules when you're in your hospital and you're treating somebody. If you don't, it's your problem. So as far as rights being usurped for patients, I blame the hospitals and clinicians. Now, as far as treatment, the adequate care, a million issues for that. There's just an overall arrogance in the carceral area that, they are prisoners. I still get a lot of discussions with wardens, and now most of the wardens are becoming more progressive. They're not the old style. And one of the things is I try to tell them, and they try to even tell these younger COs that your job is not to punish this inmate. Your job is to guard. But a lot of these guys truly believe that it's their job to be part of the punishment. There's still that attitude that within the industry that is a problem. Also, again, empathy. I give them empathy in the fact that they're not trained to be doctors, nurses, and mental health people. I mean, you look at the baby boomers, and especially in state facilities, they have high blood pressure, they have diabetes, they have all these problems. These COs aren't there to be nurses. And I understand that. The other issue we have is we do have too many people in prison. I mean, we put people in prison for technical parole violations. I mean, again, there should be a better way of doing this. Too many people in prisons because they use drugs. They weren't the big seller. I've met some guys who are kingpins in the big cities, in Philadelphia, who are in prison. They deserve to be there. I've met the user at the local jail, and all he was an addict. So we have not figured out how to, separate those two. Most people went on with a jail, and knowing that they have the potential of having a relative go there, they'd fix it,
Or desire to fix it, for sure.
Right. But it's really an out of sight, out of mind thing. It's a lack of resource thing. And some of it is just a lack of sympathy by the people in the industry, And then when when that inmate gets out, I've had nurses tell me, I don't want to know what they did, which is great, because they said, I don't know if I could be biased. And I've had other nurses, I treat them, I don't care what they do. They're still my patient. So again, the healthcare industry itself needs to understand it is their patient. It's not the person doesn't belong to the state. The patient still is a person with all the same rights as everybody else coming. It's a perfect storm. I mean,
so it is a perfect storm, and it's a wicked problem. How do we address it? What can we do to make it better when the institutions have such an imbalance of power? Because no matter how many bodies, how many liaisons, how many checks and
right. Yeah, and you're right. There's two people responsible. One of the things I always try to tell the hospitals: good policy, good education as far as what the rights of incarcerated individuals. UPMC, for instance, has a policy. It's a very good policy. I've found instances where it hasn't been used, unfortunately, but it's come into effect in about the last 2 years. Again, the same thing. I look at those things in ethics as, consultation, education, and policy as being important at the clinical level. So that helps making all that confusion and problems later. As far as the institutional level, sometimes I'm encouraged, sometimes I'm not, because I'll run into certain wardens who really know this is a problem, it's their responsibility. But like they say, you go out and get me the 10 nurses and doctors and psychiatrists I need, and I'll be really in good shape. That's an issue. I think as long as the courts don't want to get involved, I think that's going to be a problem, because there's just too many policies, too many states, too many correction facilities, and they all do their own thing. I think I actually call them fiefdoms. So as long as you have these fiefdoms, for instance, I can go to 2 prisons in Pennsylvania under the Department of Corrections, and I can tell you they'll treat one thing one way, and another prison will treat it another way, even though they have the same policy coming out of Mechanicsburg, PA. As long as these fiefdoms are like that too, you just have it. So there just needs to be better policy. And here's the other part. Politicians, it's kind of funny. We just took some politicians, educated them probably last summer. And we actually, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, took one through the prison down southwest of Pennsylvania. But a lot of them have say, I vote on the budget every year for like a couple $2 billion for the Department of Corrections. I've never been inside a prison. So again, politicians, this is an out of sight, out of mind issue. And as long as you have people that's like, I don't care, that's why you have advocates that have to come in and fill the void.
Yes. Anything else you want to talk about? I think this is great.
That covers about all of it. And like I said, it's just one of those things that it's, I kind of make the joke because people will say, where have you been? Because it's hard to find somebody. When I get calls from out of state and other places, the first thing they go is, we didn't know anybody that could talk about medical ethics and jails. And again, that goes to what I said about the colleagues in academia who just, they want to be on the front line of the abortion issue and all the other things that are big ethics, but nobody wants to deal with dirt. So I look at it this way. It is what it is, but again, it's up to the advocates to really try to make a difference.
And you certainly do, Greg. And I thank you for that.
I appreciate it, Cass.
I appreciate you. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Please stay tuned for the next one.